Awesome. Hello, everybody. Welcome to Skype a Scientist Live. Today, we are joined by John Wyatt Greenlee. Welcome and thanks for coming and joining us.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really delighted to be here.
Great. So today it's all going to be about your curiosity about eels, how they fit into history, and why we study them in a medieval historical context, and what that's all about. So here's the housekeeping for today. This session is going to be about 45 minutes, and John's going to introduce his area of work, what he studies, and then this is all going to be about your curiosity. So when you have questions, please submit them to the Q&A in the bottom. There's a little box. It has a question mark. It says Q&A. Type all your questions in there. We will try to get through as many questions as we possibly can in the next 45 minutes. Um, Other than that, let's get to it. John, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks so much, Sarah. So I'll get started kind of right off the bat. My name is John Wyatt Greenlee. As Sarah said, I am a medievalist and a historian, and my area of work has tended to focus on the role of eels, the fish, in English history from sort of the 500 to 1500 or so. So like what we sort of think of as the medieval period. And I've got a short slide presentation to sort of talk about what that looks like and give us a little bit of background about eels because not everybody knows a whole lot about eels. And then I'll just be happy to talk about eels for the rest of the time. I'll answer your questions as best I can. I am, as I said, I'm not a scientist. I'm a historian, but my work deals really closely with some important scientific issues surrounding eels, and so we'll talk about that as well. So let me share my screen here and we'll get started. Okay. All right. We see that? Sweet. All right. So eels history and more. Yeah. All right. So first off, as I said, I am a medievalist, and it's probably a good idea to start with like, what is a medievalist? And very broadly, it's somebody who studies the medieval period, who studies the history or the literature or the archaeology of this thing that we call the Middle Ages. Um, which leads to the next question is what is that? And it has a broad definition, medieval, that's sort of growing as we learn more. It tends to be this period between about 500 and 1500. We sometimes think of as like between the fall of the Roman Empire and roughly when the Americas get discovered by the Europeans. Um, and traditionally, historically, we have thought about medieval as being a very European thing, but over the last 30 or 40 years, historians and other medievalists have been trying to think about what medieval means in a more global context. So at this point, medieval can mean anything in this sort of like 1,000 to 1,500 year period, kind of all over the world. There are people who work on medieval China and medieval Europe and medieval Africa and the medieval Americas. It's not always a great term, but it's kind of the one we've got. So my area of study has been Europe and England specifically, and eels. Um, so, like I said, I'm a medieval historian, and it's probably a good idea to also sort of cover really briefly what it is that a historian does, right? What a medieval historian, which is what I am. And a historian's job is to it's a lot like a scientist. It's to try to understand the world better. A historian's job is to sort of look through material and build a better, more complete understanding of our past. You'll sometimes hear people complain that historians are trying to rewrite history because we sometimes like the history we have. And this is true. This is actually a historian's job. His We use the word history to mean two different things in our language. We use it to mean events that happened in the past, but we also use it to mean the stories we tell about those events. And we can't change how the events happen, but we can better understand the way that people have perceived them, what sort of influences those events had. And as we learn more about sort of from historical evidence, we can better understand the sort of the ways that different historical moments, what they have meant, what they can mean to us now. And history, as sort of counterintuitive as it seems, history is always about is always sort of a reflection of the present. The stories we tell about the past are always kind of have to do with where we are now and how we're thinking. And so how does a historian do this, right? So it's a lot like being a scientist. You start with a question. You're sort of looking at a historical event and there's something you don't understand or a question you have, and you make a hypothesis about it, and then you do research. For a scientist, you do research in the lab. For a historian, you do research in archives, in old documents, in old libraries. So I do a lot of my research in the British Library in London, and in other libraries like that. And that means for me, that means looking through a lot of really old, like 1,000-year-old documents and reading them and trying to make my best assessment from what I know about what they mean and what they say and what I can understand from them. And then I evaluate my hypothesis against that evidence. Does the thing that I think was going to show, does the evidence actually show that, or does it not? Do I have to reevaluate what I think happened and how I want to present it? And then follow on where that evidence leads. So, in a lot of ways, historical research is very similar in sort of its broad strokes to scientific research. It's just sort of it looks different in some ways, but the big parts of it are the same. So how do you become a medievalist, which is what I am? It the path I took at least took quite a lot of work. Went through elementary school and junior high school, and then I went to college. And then, so this is actually a second career for me. So I had, after college, I went and did something completely unrelated to history for about a decade. But then I went back to school and I went and got a master's in history. So that's a 2-year degree. And then I followed it up with a doctoral degree in history or in medieval studies, but my focus was in medieval history. And so that took 7 years. Um, and a lot of that time is dedicated to learning a lot of the skills that you need to be a really good medieval historian. Um, a lot of those have to do with language for medieval history or pretty much any history because you're looking at archival evidence. So you're looking at something that was written 1,000 years ago in a different place in the world. They're probably not writing in English. Um, and so for me, for the work that I did, I had to know English, obviously, but also I had to have sort of working knowledge of German, French, Dutch, Latin, and Old English, as well as what's called paleography, which is sort of the capacity for reading handwriting in all of these languages from, reading Latin handwriting from 1,500 years ago. So there's a lot of training in that, training in critical thinking. So as you're going through the archives and finding pieces of evidence, thinking about how they fit together and what they mean and how they fit with what you already know about the past and what you think. So the critical thinking is an important part. I don't have it on here, but reading is terribly important for just about any academic work, because among other things, you have to read a lot of the things that other people are writing and the work that other people are doing so that you have the best understanding you can of the past. Or the period of the past that you're working with. So a lot of a PhD program for history is about reading and reading and reading and thinking about the ways that other historians are interpreting the past and building our understanding of history. Science is a story that we tell ourselves about the physical world in a lot of ways. History is a story we tell ourselves about sort of our cultural world. And like science, it builds on itself. We build our research on the research that other historians have done before us. And writing, because it doesn't do you a whole lot of good to know all of this and learn all of it if you can't communicate it to other people. So those are sort of the skills that are important in being a medieval historian. Um, I am, somewhat to my surprise, I didn't intend to work with eels, but I am a historian of eels in medieval England. And I want to take a moment and talk about like when I say eels, what we're actually talking about. So there's a bunch of different kinds of eels, and I'm going to run through a couple of them. And then we'll talk about the ones that I actually work with. So I don't work with electric eels. Those aren't the kind of eels that I think about. And those tends to be the ones that people go to often very first, like, oh, electric eels. So electric eels aren't actually technically eels. They're a different kind of fish called a knife fish, and they are only native to South America. So Europeans don't find electric eels until after they have discovered electricity, actually. Um, they're very eel-like in a lot of ways, but they live their entire lives in freshwater and they are not actually an eel. The next are called moray eels, and these are the ones you would see often at like an aquarium. These are the ones that live in reefs. These are marine fish, so they spend their entire lives out at sea. They're really cool. They do a lot of interesting things. I wish I knew more about them, but those are not the eels I work with either. Um, the biggest eels in the world are called conger eels, and these are also marine eels, so they live in the ocean, although they often swim near shore. And people in medieval England ate a number of conger eels. They were important, but these are not also the ones that I work with. These get really big, though. These get up to like 300 pounds, some of them. So they're huge fish. Um, so the eels that I work with are called European eels, but there are also American eels, and they're almost exactly the same thing. And they are really interesting fish. And I'm going to spend just a minute talking about like their life cycle and what that looks like. And then we'll spend just a second talking about some of the problems they're facing. And then we can kind of move on to questions if that works. Right. So eels have this fantastic life cycle, these freshwater eels that I'm talking about. So they are all born in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. They're what are called a catadromous fish, which means they are sort of like reverse salmon. They are born in the ocean and they spend most of their lives in freshwater. So eels, all of the eels in Europe and all of the eels in the United States, and well, the Americas really, are born in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, in a place called the Sargasso Sea, which is kind of in between all of the currents. So it's a space of very still water. And they migrate sort of over the course of several years, either to the Americas or to Europe, where they live their lives, and then they wind up eventually migrating back to the Sargasso to mate and die. And they have this fantastic life cycle where they go through multiple really striking physical changes over the course of their lives. So um, oh, sorry, I got my slides out of order for a second. This is how they start out. This is what a really baby eel looks like, and they are the size of about a grain of rice. It's called a leptocephalus, and these ones I think are moray eels, but European eels look very similar. So they're see-through, right? You can see all the way through them. They don't have a digestive system at this point. They've just got kind of a start of a skeletal system and some blood. They can't really swim. They just float. And so they float around the Sargasso Sea until they reach the edge, and then they get picked up by a current, like the Gulf Stream, and they get carried to wherever they're going. American eels wind up going to the Americas. European eels wind up going to Europe. And they are actually different species. The American eels are slightly bigger. They have, I think, seven more vertebrae, and some number more vertebrae. So they are slightly different. And how they know which where to go is a kind of a mystery. But they do. They wind up going the right places. Um, and this journey takes the ones going to America take maybe a year or so. The ones going to Europe, this takes up to 3 years for them because they can't really swim for a lot of it. They float, but they grow as they go and they absorb nutrients. They're not eating because they don't have a digestive system, but they absorb nutrients from the water. And by the time they get to shore in England or other places in Europe, they look kind of like this. And at this stage, they're called a glass eel, which makes sense, right? Because you can see through them. You can, the cute little guy, you can see his eyes, you can see his spine, you can see his blood. He's got a heart. Still doesn't have a digestive system, still isn't really eating, just absorbing water. So they get to the shallows in off the coast of England at the mouth of a river. They usually show up sort of early spring, and they wait there until it gets the water coming downstream gets warm enough. Because eels are subtropical; they really prefer warmer water, and then they start swimming upstream. And while they're waiting, they transition again into what are called elvers, and that's an elver. It's now starting to actually look like an eel, right? They start getting color, they develop a digestive system, um, and they are going to spend most of their lives here living on muddy river and pond bottoms. And so they are dark on top so that predators looking down can't see them in the mud. They are light on the bottom so that predators looking up um, kind of miss them in the sun. That's the idea. And this is basically what they're going to look like as an eel. They're just going to be bigger, not a ton bigger. They get a couple feet long generally, but this is an elver. It's a little guy, and when the water gets warm enough, they start migrating upstream, and they will go find a place to live, and they will stay there. They don't move around a whole lot, although they can travel overland if they need to. But they really prefer to stay in like one pond or one very small stretch of streams for most of their lives, and we know this because scientists keep trapping the same eels in the same places year after year after year. Um, and during this time, they're what are called yellow eels because they have a sort of yellowish tint to them. Um, and they will live like this in for most of their lives. For they live in the wild, they'll live between 10 and 20 years. Although in captivity, they've lived up to about 75 years, so they can be quite long lived. As and they'll do this as what are called yellow eels. They look yellow, as you can see here, and they are technically still juveniles at this point. They don't have a developed reproductive system at all. And for a long time, people historically thought that eels didn't just sort of reproduce spontaneously, that they didn't lay eggs, they didn't reproduce sexually, they just new eels just sort of appeared. And it was Aristotle thought they grew out of the mud, and Pliny the Elder thought they rubbed themselves against rocks and created new eels that way. Sigmund Freud spent part of his youth dissecting eels looking for the reproductive organs without any success. And the reason is because they don't have them at this point, and this is when they're most likely to be caught. So at some point, when they're between 10 and 20 years old, so 15 years old or so, an eel will wake up one morning and be like, it is time for me to go. And they will leave their habitat they've been living in for the last 10 years and they will go back down to sea. And their body begins changing again at this point. It starts sort of preparing itself for this long swim back to the Sargasso Sea. They stop eating. Which makes them harder to catch because they won't take bait. They turn kind of a silvery color. Do I have a picture of one? Yeah, they're a much darker color. It's a little hard to see here. Um, and they sort of pack on fat. They become darker. Their eyes adjust to darker, like to sort of darker conditions because they're going to be swimming in sort of deeper in the ocean than they've been swimming in lakes and ponds. Um, and they start to develop a reproductive system. And they do this by essentially taking the nutrients from their digestive system, which is sort of dissolves inside their body, and they use that to build their reproductive system. And then they swim back out to sea to mate and die. Um, and then the entire cycle begins again. So those are eels. And right, there are a ton of them historically. There are still quite a lot of them, although they're endangered, and we'll talk about that in a second. But historically, up to as much as 50% of the biomass of sort of downstream sections of rivers in North America and in Europe have been made up of eels, which means if you took all the fish out of the lower part of a river and like weighed it, half that weight would be eels. So a lot of eels. So they've historically been just an enormous part of ecosystems, an enormous part of fishing ecosystems as well. And so one of the things this has meant for my work is that eels show up everywhere in medieval English history if you're looking for them. And they do it in a whole bunch of ways. So one of the things that I find really fascinating is that medieval people in England often paid their rent in eels rather than in money. And to give you a sense of numbers, so at the end of the 11th century or so, so around 1100, there were about 540,000 eels being paid in rent in England every year. And there's actually probably more than that. These are the ones that I have records of. And I can look at places where I don't have records and should and say, well, there's probably eel rents there too. But these are the ones that I can count from the archival records that I have. So 540,000 every year, which is quite a lot. There's some of the rents are really small, individual people paying 50 eels a year to their local landlord. Some of them are really big. The village of Harmston owes the Earl of Chester 75,000 eels each year. I don't know what the Earl did with 75,000 eels, but he got them. And so they're an important part of the diet, an important part of the culture, and an important part of the economy in some really weird ways. Um, They also show up in art in English history, sort of all over the place. This is maybe one of the most famous examples. This is from the Bayeux Tapestry, which looks kind of like this. It's a uh, it's a it's a tapestry talking about the William of Normandy's conquest of England in 1066. Um, and it's really fascinating. It's, as you can see here, it's 230 feet long and 20 inches tall, so it's really long and kind of narrow. But there's eels in it, and there's eels in lots of other places in English art as well. They ate a lot of them; they're part of the culture, and so that sort of reflects in other ways. They're in the language a ton. There's a huge number of eel metaphors in medieval and early modern England. Shakespeare mentions eels in his writing more than any other fish, and always as a metaphor. They're always a metaphor for something else. Metaphors are a great way for historians to think about what matters in a culture at a time, because metaphors only work if um, if if they matter to people, right? If they have to speak to something that people already know. Um, so there's this really fascinating history with eels, and um, that matters now. It matters now to think about and know about that history because eels are currently critically endangered. Over the last 40 years, they've seen about a 90% crash in population, in some places more. And while that has ticked, that's improved a little bit in the last couple of years, in the last 10 years or so, as people become aware of it, they're still it's still a real problem. And there are a number of reasons for this: habitat loss and pollution, big hydroelectric dams. So I said that eels migrate upstream to find habitats, and they could climb over and around medieval dams. That wasn't a real problem for them, but big hydroelectric dams pose considerable obstacles for them. So they've been cut off from a lot of their traditional habitats. Global warming and climate change is another issue that people are trying to track. And it's difficult with eels because they have this 3-year migration pathway before they even get to land. So it's often very difficult to trace backwards to understand what's going on with eels. The other issue that eels face is that we don't eat a lot of them in the US. And people in Europe don't eat a ton of them anymore either, but they are super popular in Asia, in Japan and China. And there's a huge black market for smuggling eels to Asian countries. It has been called Europe's ivory trade by Interpol, and it is the largest black market for smuggled animals in the world. Eels are the most smuggled animal by number and by value. It's about a $4 to $5 billion a year industry. There are eels smuggled from Europe, eels smuggled from the United States, um, and they are often smuggled in suitcases. But there's a real problem. So they face environmental issues. They face sort of critical cultural issues like this, and this is one of the places where my work interfaces with sort of scientific work because one of the things that I've really tried to do as a historian is to take the work that I've done and tell a story about our history with eels. It's very difficult sometimes for scientists to get people interested in saving eels because they're slimy and they're gross and they're weird and they remind us of snakes, and why should we care? They aren't these sort of big majestic animals like tigers or elephants. They're not cute and like otters. It's hard to get people on board with the idea that they should save eels. Um, and it doesn't, numbers don't move people. And this is an issue that I think scientists sometimes forget. Historians do too, for that matter. But numbers don't move people. It doesn't matter to people so much if you tell them that a species has had a 90% population crash. If they don't understand the context, if they don't have any connection to eels, why should I really care? And so a lot of what the work that I do involves telling interesting and hopefully funny stories about eels and eel history and the way that we as a people have had this interesting history with this fish and as a way of getting people on board with the idea of thinking about it as something that has historically been part of our ecosystems and historically been part of our culture, and is something we should think about wanting to be part of our culture and ecosystems moving forward. So that is how I, as a medieval historian with a really niche topic, have wound up um, being one of the sort of better known people in eel conservation in the world, which surprised me. It wasn't where I meant to go in with my research, but it's where I am, and it's as a historian, it's nice to be able to take the work that I do and make it matter in the world. And this is a way that I can do that. So that's kind of the end of my sort of formal presentation here. And stop the
Amazing.
sharing.
That was so cool. I learned a bunch about eels and I'm a marine biologist, so that's pretty fun. I just want to say that we have a school here that the eels are their school mascot. So that's very
Oh,
that
fantastic.
that's awesome. Okay. Okay, so we've got a lot of questions here. So I'm just gonna just like jump into it and
Yeah,
we
of
can
course.
take it from there. So one classroom asks, were there alterations in rivers in medieval times, like mills or smelting furnaces that may
Mhm.
have affected eels the way hydroelectric dams affect them today?
Yeah, no, that's a fantastic question. So, the answer is yes and no. So around 1,000 or so in England, there's a real sort of growth in building mills and mill dams. And this does affect a lot of other fish. So you can see in the archaeological records that right around 1,000, the English really like consumption of freshwater fish drops off a lot. Freshwater fish remains start disappearing, and they start eating a lot. They start doing a lot more fishing of fish from the ocean, and eating them. And there's this is a big enough thing that that archaeologists have a term for it. It's called the fish event horizon, which is a great name. Um, so the building of dams really gets in the way of migratory pathways for all kinds of fish, like salmon and other things that had traditionally been eaten pretty regularly. Eels, though, don't have a problem with medieval dams. They seem to thrive. They can, like I said, eels can move overland at need. They can spend up to a day or two out of the water if they really need to, if the conditions are right. And so they can kind of climb up and around most medieval dams. And elvers will build ropes out of themselves to sort of help facilitate that. So medieval dams, which tend to be kind of rougher and smaller, aren't that big an issue. They are for other fish, though. So the eels are fine, and you can see this in eel consumption. So I gave you eel rents from like 1100 or so. The medieval English keep eating eels in really large numbers up through at least the mid 14th century, so 1350 or so, right around the Black Death, at which point consumption changes for all sorts of reasons, and it's really hard to figure out what's going on. But to the best of my sort of figuring, eels stay really prevalent in English waters up through about the 1600 or so, at which point the English start doing a lot of draining of sort of their swamp, so what are called the fens, these low-lying swampy areas, which are eels' favorite habitat. And they're trying to make them into farming and grazing territories and lands, and they do, but that means they kill off a lot of their eel populations.
Sorry, eels. Bummer for eels.
Yeah.
Okay. Our next question comes from Argyle fifth grade classrooms. Should we stop eating eels at restaurants in North America?
So I would say yes. They, like I said, they're a critically endangered fish. There's an argument that having eels on the menu is a way of putting them into people's consciousness, and so they start thinking about like it's another way of getting people to think about eels. But they are so endangered at this point that I think it doesn't work particularly well. It is also the case that most eels you eat in the U.S. Um, mostly they're going to be in like Japanese food, unagi,
Yeah.
and they often have a really big carbon footprint because very often an eel that you eat in where is Argyle? Do we know?
Don't know where Argyle is.
Okay,
Uh,
well,
yeah.
all right. Let's say so an eel that you eat at a restaurant in New York City. It's quite possible that this eel's sort of life cycle goes like this. It is caught as an elver in Maine, shipped to New York, and then shipped from there to a growing pound in China, shipped from there to a place where it's sort of butchered in Japan, then shipped back to a fish market in New York, and then
Oh,
to the restaurant. And so, like, there is only one company in the United States, and it's very small, that actually sells American eels in America. So everything else is purchased through this really long supply chain that has a very drastic carbon footprint. So I would say probably, yeah, I wouldn't eat eels. I don't. I've had people give me eels as gifts, which is the thing that happens as you like not pet eels, but like food. It's the thing that happens when you turn into an eel historian is people give you eel. And I've eaten that because it's already dead and already like sitting in front of me. All that damage has already been done. But I wouldn't buy more eel and sort of add to the demand for it.
Yeah, totally understandable. That is what I mean. That's like one example of a zillion examples of globalization leading to
Hmm.
weird travels for like any given pair of sneakers or whatever. It's like
Yeah.
pretty wild. Um, yeah. All right. We've got a question from Quentin. What do adult eels like to eat?
Oh man, they eat just about anything. They eat bugs, they eat frogs, they eat other fish, they eat small fish. They will eat other eels. They are really happy to be cannibalistic. There are there's like a guidebook for wildlife husbandry from the 14th century, I think, called the Fleta, and it talks about how you should never like put eels. First of all, they're hard to keep in ponds because they can leave anyway, but like that you shouldn't put eels in your fish pond because they will eat all the other fish and then they'll eat each other and then they'll leave.
Just not,
So
will not be
they'll
governed.
yeah they'll eat anything. They'll eat what's the word I'm looking? They'll eat dead things as well. So they are um, they're happy to eat live things. They'll eat dead things. They will eat just about anything.
Cool. I think somewhat related to that. Is it legal to keep an eel as a pet?
As far as I know, um,
There's that guy with the eel pit
there is a guy on TikTok with a like with an eel pond under like
in his
it looks
basement,
like a
I
bomb
think.
shelter in his basement. Yeah. As far as I know, they there are some issues with keeping eels as pets. They do like to get out. And they're awfully strong. They're basically just a coil of muscle. And so they can knock lids off of fish tanks. I've heard a lot of sort of anecdotal stories about people coming in to the place where they've had eels in a tank and like the eels are out. And then you have to go find your eel lying somewhere around the room because at some point they will dry out and die. They can't live out of water forever. But they do like to escape.
Very cool. Um, all right. Well, here's an anecdote that we'd like to corroborate. While traveling in New Zealand, an Airbnb host showed us
Mm.
the eels who swam near his property. He said two of these large eels were approximately 100 years old. Is this possible?
Hmm. So there's a couple things there. The one is I think asking about the age of the eels. I think the oldest eel ever sort of recorded was one that was kept in captivity in Denmark, and lived to I think be about 79 years old. So that's conceivable. I think I've heard legends of older eels than that, like eels that get trapped in wells and live there kind of forever. And part of what's going on there is like they because they're essentially juveniles. Their bodies sort of don't mature until they're kind of ready to go out to sea to mate and die. So if that never happens, they kind of stay in this juvenile state. And the theory is that they can stay there kind of forever, but old age catches up with everybody eventually. The so 100 years feels like a long time for an eel living in the wild that can just get up and leave, but I don't know. The eels they have in New Zealand, which are called longfins, they're the biggest freshwater eels in the world, and they're really amazing. They're huge, and there are a lot of places in New Zealand, and maybe you did this, where like you can go feed them and kind of wander out with them, and they're really cool. They got beautiful blue eyes.
Cool. One of the students asked, are eels friendly?
Yeah, they are. They are. I've had a lot of, so I'm a medievalist, so my work doesn't come up to the modern period, but I've had a number of people talk to me about like um, memories that they have of like a dock that their grandfather had out on the fen or the river behind his house, and he'd go out there, and the eels would come up, and he'd kind of whistle to them and feed them. So like they're they are friendly. They will eat you if you're dead in the water. So there's that. But I think most animals will do
Oh, well,
that.
you're a cat, you know?
Yeah, exactly. But yeah, they are. They are.
Cool. Nina wants to know, I mean, you kind of answered this, but are eels commercially farmed? Or because you can't re get them to reproduce in a normal place, they're
Right. So,
stored?
yes and no. And I know that seems to be the answer for a lot of things with eels, but they're a slippery sort of fish in a lot of ways. Eels will not reproduce in captivity. So you can't farm them in the way that you could with other animals, where like you sort of grow them from eggs. So any eel that you see anywhere in the world is like in a tank or on a plate was wild caught. And it might have been wild caught when it was a glass eel and then grown. So there are eel farms, but they are entirely reliant on wild caught
Oh, cotton
eels
eels.
that they then grow.
Hmm. Cool. Are there farms in North America for
Just
this sort of
just
thing?
one, and
Just
I
one.
mentioned it a little bit
Yeah.
ago, but there's one eel farm in North America that there may be more. That's the only one that I know of.
You know.
It's a company called American Unagi. It's based in Maine.
Yeah.
Maine is one of only two states that allow commercial eel fishing. The
Oh,
other is either North or South Carolina. I can't remember which one.
cool.
But most of the fishing for eels that happens in the U.S. happens in Maine, where it is the second largest cash crop after lobster.
Good to know. Did not get, wouldn't have guessed that. So where are they caught? Like I know in the ocean along the Gulf Stream
So no, actually, they're generally caught in streams as they're coming up. So
in the
you put
stream.
out nets and they just kind of swim into the nets
Cool.
during
Um,
during their upstream migration. Or so that's currently now right now the way we fish for eels is we're fishing for elvers. The way that medieval people would have done it was actually the opposite. Generally, all the eels that were paid in rent were silver eels, so they were caught during the downstream migration, but also in nets and traps and things.
oh, nice. Thanks. Carrie wants to know what is the largest eel you've ever seen in person?
Oh, not very big actually. And I've only seen a couple of them in person, so a couple feet long, maybe 6 or 8 pounds, which is big for a fish, but like they can get quite a lot larger than that. The like the longfin eels in New Zealand, which is sort of on my bucket list of things to do, is to go swimming with them,
Hmm,
are 5 or 6 feet long and weigh a good bit more.
cool. Our next question comes from Orlando Gifted Academy, third grade class. What made you want to become a historian? We already answered what do eels eat. So what attracted you to becoming a historian?
I've always been really fascinated by stories about the past. When I was a little kid, I that was a lot of what I read was history books, and medieval history for that matter. I just found it really fascinating. And then, like I said, after college, I coached volleyball for about a decade. And when I sort of had come to the end of that, and I was thinking about what I wanted to do, I kept coming back to having a real interest in trying to understand the past better and like build a better story about who we are and where we've come from. So it's that really. It's a real interest in sort of in better understanding us as people.
That's really cool. That makes sense. That's very interesting to think about. Okay, Joey wants to know, how can like what actions can we take to help protect eels?
Well, there's a couple different things. So eels are some of it has to do with habitat. Sort of habitat loss is a real issue with eels, and there used to be eels all over the place in the U.S. Or on the eastern half of the U.S. Basically, we don't have any eels on the west coast at all. There's lampreys, but lampreys are not eels; they're a completely different fish. Um, some of it is habitat. There aren't a ton of eels left in the U.S. at this point. There are some on the East Coast, and there's some places where you can do sort of citizen science work. Like I know that New York has on the Hudson River has a citizen science program through its Fish and Wildlife program, where they have people go out and sort of count the elvers. They have traps, so they go out and trap the elvers and count them and try to get a sense for how many elvers are coming upstream. There's some places where people have projects helping eels as get around dams. There are some of those projects on the Susquehanna and some in upstate New York as well. Um, so I think probably I would say, given how few eels there sort of are in a lot of the U.S., that part of what you can do is just awareness. Talk about eels. It's what I do.
Talk about eels.
Like I said, sort of get people past the idea that they're kind of gross and weird, and get them thinking about them as a fish that matter.
That's a great advice. Talk about eels. This is good. Ms. Williams' class wants to know, how did eels get the name eel?
that is a fun question. So there's a bit of disagreement about that. Because English is a complicated language with a weird history. So the Latin word for eel is anguilla, which is sort of related to the Latin word for snake. And there's that eel sound in anguilla, and so that's quite possible. Also, the Old English word for water is ale, which is also the word for eel, and in like the northern parts of England is also the word for like a low-lying swampy area, an ale. And so there's some question about whether or not like the word has to do with water, right? It's sort of a like a snake in the water in some ways. So it's not quite clear, honestly, whether it has to do with water or is from the Latin, or if it's both, if it's sort of a combination of both.
Cool. Thanks. We've got a really fun question here from Karen. Is medieval handwriting better or worse than today's handwriting?
Um, that's an amazing question. Um, and the answer is yes to both. So medieval handwriting changes a lot over, you're looking at, even if you're just thinking about Europe, you're thinking about 1,000 years and an entire continent. There's a lot of different varieties of handwriting and a lot of different sort of what's the word? A lot of different like styles and trends in handwriting. Um, and what tends to happen is over the course of like several hundred years, handwriting in Europe in its Latin tends to get worse and worse and worse and worse until you get to a point where somebody is like, no, no, this, I can't read this, we're done. And then they go back to having something that is super clear and easy to read. So this happens in the ninth century in France. Um, so it, you may know Charlemagne was the king of France, the king of the Franks, and he's a member of it's called the Carolingian, sort of named after him, Carolingian dynasty. And he introduces a style of handwriting which is called Carolingian minuscule, which is super clear and easy to read. The handwriting that the court had used before that was called the Merovingian court, and it's called Merovingian chancery script. And it has been described as looking like the wanderings of a demented spider. It is almost impossible to read. And so, like, at some point, Charlemagne is like, no, I want something that I can read by looking at. And then it gets, after that, it sort of gets worse and worse and worse and worse and worse. And then you kind of get to the Renaissance where people go back to a really clear, flowing script that's very easy to read. And which is where we get italics now. We call it italics because it's from Italy. It's an Italian script. So it's sort of a script that essentially looks like modern English in italics. Um, so the answer is sometimes it's super clear to read, and sometimes it is like hair-pullingly frustrating to read.
Where are we at right now? It like if you were to
Um,
guess. I would guess worse because I feel like my parents' generation all like this is like maybe a very Philadelphia answer, but like all went to Catholic school. All their handwriting is all not identical, but very similar. They all like learned the Palmer method of cursive.
mhm.
Everybody's
Yeah,
handwriting looks the same, and ours is a nightmare.
yeah, and I have a 10-year-old whose handwriting is like, oh my God, um, it is very, very bad, and it is something that they have not stressed in school.
Right.
And so yeah, I think probably we're at a point where sort of individual handwriting may be quite good, but as a rule, our handwriting's not that great.
Pretty bad. Yeah.
Mine's not very good.
Computers are not helping anybody with that.
No, not for that.
Not for that. Cool. Okay. Well, we have been talking excitedly for almost 45 minutes now. Because this has been very different from what we normally talk about too, which has been really fun. Um, so I'm just going to ask you, we ask everybody the same two questions at the end of these sessions. Um, and the first of these two questions that we ask everyone is if you had everyone's attention in the world and you could tell them one thing within the bounds of your area of expertise, what would you tell them?
Hmm. Oh, that's a great question. Um, I would tell them that eels matter, that it matters to understand the history of this animal to because it helps us understand its place in sort of the world now, and that they matter, that saving eels or an umbrella species in a way, saving eels means saving a habitat that covers a lot of other animals. So if you're thinking about doing work that saves eels, you are also doing work that saves just a sort of really pretty broad spectrum of the ecology. So I would say that eels matter. That would be my takeaway.
This is good. All right, our second question is very similar. You still have everybody's attention in the world, and you can tell
Good.
them one thing about anything. Whatever. It can be like serious and significant or like silly goose stuff. It can be whatever you want.
Oh, wow, that's interesting too. Right, so I got to eels through maps. I meant to be a historian of maps and cartographic history, and I still work on maps a lot. I would tell everybody to be very critical about the maps you have in front of you because maps are, we often think of them as sort of neutral arbiters of truth. Like a map, it shows us the world, but maps, like history or like science, are a product of human creation and invention, and that they are often as much about what doesn't get included as what does. Um, and so maps always have an agenda, that doesn't have to be bad, but they always have an agenda, and you always have to think about that. So I would add that to the top
This
of the
is the
pile.
perfect week to talk about that because the Gulf of Mexico. It's been a big week for maps.
Yep.
Big week for maps for sure. Big month maybe for maps. Okay, well that was really great. Is there anything else you'd like to share with everybody watching?
I don't think so. I think that sort of covers it. I've really enjoyed the opportunity to come and talk with all of you. I wish I'd been able to answer sort of every question we got in front of us,
Yeah.
but thank you so much for everybody for your time and attention and questions. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing this with us. This has been really fun. And thank you, Jim, for interpreting. We really appreciate you being here.
Yes, thank you so much, Jim.
Um, cool. Everybody at home, we will be back again next month. Next month, are we talking about space or volcanoes? I can't remember. We're talking about volcanoes next month. That'll be March 13th,
Sweet.
talking about volcanoes. Space will be the following month, April 11th, and then we'll be talking about how shrimp swim in May. So please join us for all of those. Also, keep in mind, I know at these sessions we get more questions than we could possibly answer, but you can have a scientist talk with just your group. If you sign up for our matching program, we match classrooms, as you know, with scientists every week. For Q&A sessions with just your group on Zoom or wherever it is that you like to meet most. So feel free to go to skypeascientist.com, request a match, and tell your colleagues that we exist too. It's been a pretty stressful, tumultuous time for science in the United States this year. Things are a little scary for us as a group, and we really, really love talking with you all about the work that we do, why it's important, and frankly, sharing eel facts and squid facts and volcano facts and all this stuff. We love it. So if we can get you matched up with a scientist, we'd love to do it. It's all free. So please take advantage of our program. That's all I got for you today. I hope you all stay safe and have a wonderful month until next time. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye.